There is a man whose name appears in 23 separate newspaper archives between the years 1909 and 1931, and yet in all of that ink, across all of those columns and wire dispatches and regional weeklies, not a single word was ever spoken directly by him. Not one. The smell of him when they finally pulled him from the ice, that particular smell, which witnesses later described not as decay, not as death, but as something older, something mineral and prehistoric, like water that had never seen the sun. That smell, they said, stayed in their clothes for days. He was alive. He was breathing. His eyes were open. And from that moment forward, for the remaining 41 years of his life, he refused to explain a single thing about what had happened to him, and he refused to let anyone else do so on his behalf. Wherever you are watching this tonight, whether it's past midnight and the house is quiet, or early morning before the world has started, leave a comment and tell us. Tell us the time and the city, because this kind of story, the kind that was never fully told, deserves witnesses. His name was Elias Vaughan. That was not his birth name. That detail matters, and we will come back to it. To understand what happened to Elias Vaughan, you have to first understand what life looked like in the northwestern territories of Canada in the autumn of 1908. Not the abstract historical Canada of textbooks, the specific, tactile, frequently brutal Canada of a logging camp, established on the southern fringe of a lake district that had no official name on any government survey. The camp was called Kessler's Landing by the men who worked it, named after the Finnish foreman, Arto Kessler, who had negotiated the original timber contract with a Montreal supply company that itself had no permanent address. These were the kinds of arrangements that governed much of the resource economy in that era. Informal, documented only partially, sustained by handshakes and the practical understanding that no government inspector was likely to travel 12 hours by wagon through boreal forest to check on paperwork. The camp housed between 40 and 60 men at any given time, depending on the season. In the autumn, it swelled. The summer's work had been good, the pine stands were dense and relatively accessible, and the river grade allowed for log driving in the spring melt without requiring the expensive engineering of some of the more ambitious northern operations. Men came from everywhere, from Poland, from Ukraine, from the French-speaking parishes of Quebec, from the Maritimes, from a handful of American border towns in Minnesota and North Dakota, where the same economic desperation that drove men into mines drove them just as easily into forests. The work was back-breaking in the literal sense. Axes and two-man crosscut saws, teams of horses on skid roads, dragging logs to the nearest waterway. 12 hours of labor in temperatures that by October had already begun their long descent toward hostile. The men ate enormous quantities of beans and salt pork and bread baked in communal ovens. They slept in bunkhouses on straw mattresses, sometimes 2 to a bunk in the coldest weeks, and the smell of 40 unwashed men in a sealed wooden building was something that newcomers spent approximately 3 days adjusting to before it ceased to register entirely. Into this world, sometime in late September of 1908, arrived Elias Vaughan. No one remembered exactly when he appeared. That itself is notable. In the tight social ecology of an isolated logging camp, new arrivals were events. You noticed them. You assessed them immediately. Their size, their bearing, whether they seemed like men who had done this kind of work before, whether they seemed like men who might cause problems. Yet of the 14 men from Kessler's Landing who later gave any form of account about the events of that winter, not one of them could specifically recall the moment Elias Vaughan walked in. He was simply at some point there. What they could recall was his appearance. He was tall, but not unusually so. Somewhere between 30 and 40 years old, though this estimate varied by as much as a decade between different witnesses, which is itself a strange thing when you consider that these were men who spent months in close proximity to him. He had what several of them described as a European face, which in the vernacular of the time and place was less an ethnic observation than a cultural one. A certain seriousness of expression, a quality of reserve that distinguished him from the more gregarious Canadians and Americans in the camp. He wore good boots, This detail was mentioned repeatedly and by multiple witnesses in subsequent years. His boots were noticeably well made, the kind that cost money, the kind that suggested he had come from somewhere with resources, or had once occupied a station in life that the forest camp did not reflect. He was quiet, not sullen, not antisocial. He ate with the other men, he worked his assigned position without complaint, he responded to direct questions with brief and unremarkable answers, but he did not volunteer conversation. He did not participate in the long, rambling evening discussions that were the primary entertainment in a camp without electricity or newspapers delivered more often than twice a month. He listened, he watched, and when the lamps were turned low, he was usually the first man already in his bunk, facing the wall. Otto Kessler, the foreman, later described him in a letter to a Montreal business associate as a steady worker, not the strongest but efficient, never late and never complaining. Kessler also noted, almost parenthetically, that Vaughan had an odd habit of going outside alone at night, for sometimes an hour, which I attributed to insomnia or the need to relieve himself, and thought nothing of it until later. Later. That word appears in almost every account connected to Elias Vaughan. People consistently understood things about him only in retrospect, only once the frame had changed. The winter of 1908 arrived in that part of Canada with unusual ferocity and unusual speed. By the first week of November, temperatures had dropped to levels that even the experienced northern hands found extreme. The work continued. It always continued because the economic model demanded it, but the operating radius of the camp contracted. Men did not venture far. The forest in deep winter had its own psychology. The silence was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a presence. The snow muffled everything except the occasional crack of a tree contracting in the cold. Sounds that in the dark could be mistaken for gunshots, for footsteps, for things that had no name. On the morning of November 14th, 1908, Elias Vaughan did not appear for the morning meal. This was noted without particular alarm. Men were sometimes sick. The bunkhouse was checked. His bunk was empty. His coat and his boots, those good boots, were gone. A cursory search of the immediate camp perimeter found nothing. Kessler made a log entry noting the absence. By afternoon, when Vaughan had still not returned, a more organized search was conducted in the surrounding tree line. Nothing was found. No tracks, which was itself strange, because it had not snowed the previous night and tracks should have been visible for some distance in the packed surface snow. That absence of tracks. It is the detail that troubled people most, even more than the disappearance itself. One of the searchers, a man named Gustav Brandt, who had worked northern camps for 15 years, and who by his own account was not a fanciful man, later told a journalist, in 1921, 13 years after the events, that the lack of tracks had felt wrong in a way I could not explain technically. He had walked those paths himself that morning on the way to the latrine before the search began, and the surface snow had been undisturbed in every direction he could see from the bunkhouse door. Kessler's official response was pragmatic. He made a notation in the camp ledger. E. Vaughan, absent without notice, November 14th, 1908. Presumed departed. He deducted the outstanding wages from the account and reassigned the bunk. The Montreal Supply Company was not notified because there was no provision in the camp's administrative structure for notifying anyone about the voluntary departure of a laborer. Men left camps all the time. Some left in the middle of winter, which was dangerous and inadvisable but not unprecedented. People made bad decisions. The North did not distinguish between the wise and the foolish. The other men in the camp adjusted. A few expressed curiosity about where Vaughan had gone. A few wondered aloud about the tracks. One man, a young Quebecois named Henri Pelletier, who was 17 years old at the time, and who would later become the most detailed and consistent source of testimony about the events, told his bunkmate that he had heard something the night before Vaughan disappeared. A sound outside the bunkhouse after midnight, not footsteps exactly, not an animal. Something rhythmic and low that he could not characterize more precisely than like a voice but not speaking any language. He told no one else at the time because he understood with the social intelligence of a young man in a hierarchical, all-male environment, that reporting something like that would cost him credibility he could not afford. 11 weeks passed. The camp continued its winter routine. The deep cold settled in and did not relent. Logging operations were reduced to the most essential maintenance tasks. The men occupied themselves with card games, with mending equipment, with the particular species of patience that northern isolation demands. Kessler noted in his ledger the usual small catastrophes of a winter camp. A man with a badly infected hand, a horse that went lame, a section of roof on the equipment shed that required emergency repair. Nothing remarkable. Then, on the morning of February 3rd, 1909, Henrik Lund, a broad-shouldered Norwegian who worked on the Skid Road crew and who was known in the camp for his equanimity and his complete indifference to cold, stepped outside before dawn to check on one of the horses and found Elias Vaughan standing at the edge of the clearing. Standing, not approaching the camp, not calling out. Standing perfectly still at the tree line, approximately 40 yards from the nearest structure, facing the camp with an expression that Lund would later describe, in multiple accounts over many years, as not the expression of a man who has been lost. Lund stared at him for what he estimated as several seconds, then called back into the bunkhouse. By the time Kessler and 2 other men came outside, Vaughan had not moved. He had not spoken. He was standing in the pre-dawn dark in his original coat and his original boots, and he was looking at them, and the temperature was minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The first thing they noticed after the shock of recognition was that he showed no signs of frostbite. None. His hands were bare. His gloves were not on his hands. They were tucked into his coat pocket, as if he had removed them deliberately. And his face was exposed and neither blue nor mottled, nor showing the waxy pallor that even brief extreme cold exposure produces. He had been standing in that temperature for an unknown length of time in a state of apparent stillness. Lund later said that the snow around Vaughan's feet showed no disturbance at all, as though he had not shifted his weight even once. They brought him inside. He walked with them without resistance, without assistance, under his own power. He sat in the chair they offered him. He accepted the tin mug of hot coffee that Pelletier, who had been awakened by the commotion, pressed into his hands. He looked at the mug for a long moment before drinking, and then someone asked him where he had been. He looked up. He looked at the man who had asked, a Quebec man named Arsenault, who was standing nearest to him. He looked at him with an expression that no one in that room could ever subsequently agree on. Some said it was blank. Some said it was afraid. Henri Pelletier, who was watching from the back of the room and who had perhaps the most sensitive read on human expression of anyone present, said in his 1924 account that the expression was neither of those things. He said it was the expression of a man who has been asked a question to which he knows the answer, but understands that the answer cannot be given. Not will not, cannot. Vaughan said nothing. They tried again. Kessler, who was a practical and not unkind man, spoke to him in several languages: Finnish, Swedish, a phrase or two of German, the basic French he had acquired from his Quebec workers. Vaughan's eyes tracked him. His comprehension was clearly unimpaired. He understood what was being said to him. He simply did not respond. He finished the coffee. He looked at his own hands for a long time, turning them over in his lap as though checking them for something. Kessler made him eat. The kitchen produced salt pork and bread, and Vaughan consumed it methodically, without enthusiasm, without the ravenousness you would expect from a man who had been missing for 11 weeks in a northern winter. He did not eat like a starving man. He ate like a man performing a remembered function. The distinction was noted by multiple witnesses, and it troubled all of them, though none of them could fully articulate why. That evening, the camp doctor, or rather, the man who served in that capacity, a former medical student from Manitoba named Callum Price, who had abandoned his studies after 2 years and who provided basic medical care for the camp in exchange for reduced board, examined Vaughan. Price's written account of this examination, a 3-page handwritten document discovered in 1967 in a provincial archive in Edmonton, is one of the most important primary sources connected to this case. Price recorded that Vaughan was in excellent physical health, No frostbite, as previously noted. No signs of starvation or severe nutritional deficiency, which was medically extraordinary for a man who had spent 11 weeks in subarctic conditions in a region offering virtually no accessible food sources in deep winter. No wounds, no infection. His reflexes were normal. His pulse was slow but steady. His eyes were clear and responsive. The examination revealed one physical anomaly, which Price described with careful, almost reluctant precision. Vaughan's fingernails and the nails on his toes had grown to an extent consistent, in Price's estimation, with not less than 4 months, and possibly considerably more. Price noted this without explanation, because he had none. He added a single line at the bottom of his medical notes that would not be read by another person for 58 years. I do not know what this man has experienced, but I am quite certain that whatever it was, he has decided not to recover from it in the usual way. Word spread through the camp by the following morning, as word always does in enclosed communities. The men processed it in the ways available to them, with dark humor, with theological reference, with the superstitions of their respective cultural backgrounds. The Poles in the camp spoke of a figure from Slavic folklore, a wanderer who crosses into a particular kind of wilderness and returns changed. The Norwegians, less explicitly, grew quiet when Vaughan entered a room. The Quebecois crossed themselves. The practical English-speaking Canadians said that the man had clearly found shelter somewhere, perhaps an abandoned trapper's cabin, and that his silence was the stubbornness of a private man who did not owe any of them an explanation. Kessler wrote to the Montreal Supply Company within the week. His letter, which has survived, is measured and factual. He describes the disappearance, the return, the physical condition, the silence. He asks for guidance. The supply company's response, which arrived 3 weeks later, was terse. Retain the man if he is able to work. Notify us of any further irregularities. This was the entirety of institutional attention that Vaughan's case received at the time. He was able to work. He returned to his duties without being asked. He was efficient and reliable as he had always been. The other men gave him a wider berth than before, physically and socially. The evening conversations grew quieter when he was present. People stopped asking him questions, not because they had lost curiosity, but because the silence with which he met every inquiry had a quality that discouraged repetition. It was not hostile silence. It was not performative silence. It was the silence of a man who had removed himself from a particular kind of human transaction, and who showed no signs of returning to it. There was one exception to this silence in the months that followed, a single, partial exception. In April of 1909, as the spring thaw was beginning and the camp was preparing for the log drive season, Henri Pelletier was working alone in the equipment shed, oiling a set of harness straps, when Vaughan came in. Vaughan did not acknowledge Pelletier directly. He went to the far end of the shed, apparently looking for a particular tool. He found it, he turned to leave, and then he stopped, with his back still to Pelletier, and he said something, in French. 4 words. Pelletier heard them clearly. He heard them clearly enough that he repeated them to no one for 15 years, keeping them private with the instinct of a man who understands that certain information, released too early or to the wrong people, can metastasize into something uncontrollable. When he finally shared what Vaughan had said, in 1924, in a handwritten letter to a researcher at McGill University who was compiling a study on psychological trauma in isolated labor environments, a study that was never published, Pelletier transcribed the 4 words exactly. We will come to those words, but the order of this story demands patience. Vaughan left Kessler's Landing in June of 1909, when the spring contract concluded. He left without incident, collecting his wages and departing on the supply wagon heading south. Kessler noted his departure in the ledger with the same brevity he had noted his return. E. Vaughan departed June 12, 1909. Wages settled, no outstanding issues. And yet Vaughan did not disappear. Not this time. For the next 22 years, he left a trail, faint, irregular, sometimes years apart but traceable, through the documentary record of the Canadian Northwest and later the American Midwest. Not through anything he said or did that drew attention, through the fact that other people noticed him and occasionally wrote about it. The first appearance after Kessler's landing was in Winnipeg, in the winter of 1910. A brief item in the Winnipeg Tribune, buried in a column of miscellaneous city notes, mentioned a man who had been observed on 3 consecutive evenings, standing on the bank of the Assiniboine River after midnight, fully clothed and motionless, in temperatures well below freezing. A police officer had approached him on the 3rd occasion. The man had produced valid identification. The Tribune noted this without reproducing it, and had stated, reportedly, in a quiet and composed voice with a slight European accent, that he was experiencing insomnia and preferred to walk at night. The officer had found no cause for intervention and had noted the encounter only in his duty log, from which the Tribune had apparently drawn. The man's name was not given in the newspaper item, but the duty log, which a researcher accessed in 1971, identified him as Elias Vaughan, occupation, laborer, place of domicile, not permanent. The pattern of standing still outdoors in the cold at night that Kessler had noticed as an insomnia habit at the camp. It continued. It was documented again in 1913 in a small Saskatchewan town called Hafford, where a hardware store owner named Tremblay kept a personal journal that has been partially preserved. Tremblay wrote that a man he later identified from a Labor Department employment register as Elias Vaughan had rented a room in the boarding house above his store for 3 weeks in the autumn of that year. He was a quiet tenant, Tremblay wrote, but the woman across the street told my wife she had seen him standing in the backyard at 3 in the morning on at least 4 occasions, not moving, just standing, which she said made her uneasy, though he had done nothing wrong by it. In 1916, during the height of the First World War, there is a record of a man named Vaughan being processed by a military conscription board in Regina, Saskatchewan. He was examined and rejected. The rejection record, brief and administrative, listed the reason as psychological examination, unfit. No elaboration was given. The military medical officer who conducted the examination, a doctor, Arthur Melling, left no personal notes on the case, but a colleague of his, in a letter written to his wife in 1917 and preserved in a family collection, mentioned without naming names that Melling had told him about a curious fellow who came through the board last autumn. A laborer of some kind, who was perfectly healthy in every physical measure, but who, when asked the standard questions about his history, simply looked at the examining physician without answering for so long that it became clear he was not going to answer, and who, when finally asked if he understood the question, said, and Melling swore this was word for word, "I understand them completely. They are just no longer the right questions for me." No longer the right questions. That phrase, that one documented spoken sentence from a man who almost never spoke, circulated quietly among the small number of researchers who became interested in Vaughan's case in later decades. It suggested something important. Not that Vaughan was unable to communicate, not that he was mentally impaired or dissociated in the clinical sense that psychiatry of the era was beginning to map. It suggested that he had undergone some experience that had restructured his relationship to ordinary human inquiry in a way that rendered most questions, the kinds of questions normal life asks of a person, simply beside the point. The question of what that experience had been remained entirely unanswered. Journalists found him 5 times between 1909 and 1931. Each occasion is documented, and each occasion ended in the same way. The first was in 1912, when a reporter from an Edmonton newspaper heard about the Kessler's Landing incident through Ardo Kessler himself, who had returned to Edmonton after the timber contract concluded. Kessler was not a gossip and did not seek out publicity, but he spoke to the reporter, who was writing a general piece about life in the northern camps, and mentioned the incident as one of several unusual things he had witnessed in his years of camp management. The reporter became interested and tracked Vaughan to a milling operation outside of Red Deer where he was briefly employed. The reporter introduced himself. He explained that he had spoken with Kessler. He said he was not interested in causing trouble and that he simply wanted to understand what had happened. Vaughan looked at him. He picked up his work gloves, which had been resting on a fence rail during a brief rest period. He put them on. He returned to work. He did not look at the reporter again, and the reporter, after standing for several minutes in the cold, left. The second journalist encounter was in 1917 in Calgary. A woman. This is significant because female journalists were rare in that era, and this detail was specifically noted, named Margaret Holt, who worked for a small progressive monthly publication that covered labor issues and worker welfare, had learned of Vaughan through the military rejection record, which an anti-conscription activist had shared with her as an example of medical bureaucracy's inadequacy. She found him at a livery stable where he was working as a handler. She approached him during the noon hour. She told him that she was not interested in sensationalizing anything, that she believed he had likely experienced something that deserved to be understood rather than gawked at, and that she was prepared to print only what he wanted to share. He listened to this entire introduction without interrupting. When she finished, he said one word, "No." Then he stood up, walked to the far end of the stable, and began working again. Margaret Holt wrote a short article about him anyway, drawn entirely from secondary sources. It was the most accurate and respectful piece written about him during his lifetime. She described him as a man who appears to have made a decision about his own interior life that bears the permanence of something architectural. The third, fourth, and fifth encounters followed similar patterns over the subsequent years. A reporter in 1921, a researcher in 1924, who was not a journalist, but who had the same result. A man who identified himself as a writer in 1929, in a small town in Minnesota, where Vaughan had settled for approximately 4 years, the longest he stayed in any one place after Kessler's Landing. 4 years in a town called Bemidji, working for a lumber yard, living in a rooming house, attending no church, joining no civic organization, speaking to no one beyond the requirements of work and commerce. The rooming house in Bemidji was run by a widow named Clara Anstruther. She kept the house from 1921 until her death in 1944, and the account she gave to her daughter, which the daughter transcribed in a 1963 memoir that was privately printed and circulated among family members before a copy reached a university library in the 1980s, is among the most detailed portraits of Vaughan's daily life that exists. Clara Anstruther described him as the ideal tenant in every practical sense. He paid his rent 2 weeks in advance, always. He was clean and quiet and caused no damage to the property. He did not bring visitors. He did not drink. Or if he did it with such invisibility that Clara, who was attentive to the signs, never detected it. He ate breakfast in the communal dining room on most mornings, sitting apart from the other tenants if the arrangement of the table allowed it, eating quickly and without apparent pleasure, always leaving before anyone else. He accepted Clara's small domestic courtesies, the mended shirt button, the extra portion at Sunday dinner, with a nod, and something that she consistently described as almost a smile, but one that had traveled a very long distance to get to his face. He had nightmares. Clara knew this because his room was directly above her own bedroom, and on perhaps 1 or 2 nights each week she would hear sounds from above, not screaming, not thrashing, but a sound she could only describe as low and continuous, like a man reciting something to himself in the dark. It lasted between 15 and 40 minutes and then stopped. She never raised the subject with him. He never acknowledged it. They maintained for 4 years the gentle fiction of normalcy that good landladies and difficult tenants sometimes construct between them. Clara also noted, and this is in the memoir, with her daughter's observation that her mother still found it remarkable 40 years later, that on the 4 winters Vaughan spent in Bemidji, he did not, to Clara's knowledge, ever use additional blankets. The rooming house was not well heated. Minnesota winters are brutal. Every other tenant, without exception, requested additional bedding by November. Vaughan did not. She checked his room when he was at work one February morning. with the matter-of-fact pragmatism of a woman managing a property who is not overly concerned with privacy, and found that he had removed even the standard blanket that came with the room. He slept, apparently, with only a sheet in a room where the temperature fell below 50 degrees on cold nights. He left Bemidji in 1931. Clara did not know where he went. He gave 2 weeks' notice, paid what he owed, shook her hand when he left, the only physical contact she had ever initiated or received from him in 4 years, and departed on a morning bus heading east. She stood at the window and watched the bus leave, and then, she wrote, she went upstairs and stood in his empty room for a long time, looking at the perfectly made bed, and felt something she could not name but which she compared, inadequately, to the feeling of looking at a painting in a museum that you know you will never see again. It was in that same period, 1931, that the most significant piece of documentary evidence connected to Elias Vaughan was discovered, not by a researcher, not by a journalist, but by accident, by a postal worker in a small town in Ontario who was sorting a bag of returned undeliverable mail and noticed that one letter had been opened and resealed, and that the name on the address was written in a hand that struck him as somehow wrong. The postal worker, whose name was Owen Cathcart, kept the letter for reasons he was never fully able to explain. He told his son about it in 1952, and his son, who had become a teacher and had an interest in local history, eventually connected it to the existing fragmentary record on Vaughan and donated it to a university archive in 1978. The letter was addressed to the Montreal supply company that had operated Kessler's Landing. The supply company had dissolved in 1914. The letter had therefore bounced through the postal system for several years before being deemed undeliverable. It was written on plain paper in English, in a small and extremely precise handwriting. The name given at the bottom was not Elias Vaughan. It was a different name entirely, a German name, 2 words, which the archive catalogued under a pseudonym for preservation reasons without disclosing the original, a decision that subsequent researchers have found baffling and which has never been fully explained. The content of the letter is brief. It runs to less than 100 words. It does not describe what happened at Kessler's Landing. It does not explain the disappearance or the return or the silence. What it does, in those few words, is ask a question. A specific, technical question about the survey records for the Lake District north of the camp. Specifically, it asks whether the supply company had ever received or been aware of any survey report concerning a geological formation in that region described in any documentation as the lower shelf or the deep shelf. That is all. A question about a geological formation, with no context given, no explanation of why the question was being asked, no indication of what answer was expected or desired. Researchers subsequently spent considerable effort attempting to locate any survey documentation referring to such a formation in the relevant region. The geological survey records for northern Alberta and the adjacent territories in that period were incomplete and inconsistently archived. 2 researchers found partial survey notes from a 1901 expedition that mentioned, in a single passing reference, a limestone shelf formation in the Lake District as a feature of the hydrological system, a submerged ledge, essentially, running beneath several of the deeper lakes. The note was purely technical, of no particular scientific significance, and drew no further attention in any subsequent survey. A submerged shelf, underwater, in a region of deep, cold, lightless lakes. The implication sits there, in the documentary record, without being stated. And it is the nature of this particular story that nothing is ever stated. Every piece of evidence is a question pretending to be a fact. Every fact is a door without a handle. Henri Pelletier's 1924 letter to the McGill researcher finally revealed the 4 words Vaughan had spoken in the equipment shed in April of 1909. 15 years of silence around those words, and then Pelletier gave them, in French, as he had heard them. Je n'y étais pas. I was not there. I was not there. A man who had been missing for 11 weeks. standing in a shed, not looking at the person he was speaking to, saying, "I was not there." Not, "I cannot explain it." Not, "Please do not ask." Not, "Something happened to me." Instead, a statement of negation, a denial not of the facts but of the location. He had been somewhere for 11 weeks, somewhere in the boreal winter, and whatever that somewhere was, he was saying that it was not there, not in the forest, not in a trapper's cabin, not anywhere on the surface of the ordinary world that his colleagues assumed he had wandered through. The McGill researcher, whose name was Dr. Frieda Hartmann, was a pioneer in the nascent field of what we would today recognize as trauma psychology, though the vocabulary of her era did not yet possess the precision of ours. She incorporated Pelletier's testimony into a larger study she was compiling on what she termed experiential dissociation in isolated labor populations, the psychological phenomena she had observed in men who had survived mine collapses, shipwrecks, and long-duration Arctic exposure. She died in 1931 before completing the study. Her notes were archived, accessed sporadically over the following decades, and finally, the relevant sections were published in a small academic journal in 1974. Hartmann's interpretation of Vaughan's statement was careful and deliberately tentative. She did not speculate about the literal content of the 4 words. She focused instead on their function. She observed that in her research, individuals who had undergone extreme dissociative experiences that had in some sense removed them from the normal continuity of their own consciousness, sometimes developed a relationship to language in which the ordinary categories of presence and absence became unstable. When such an individual said, "I was not there," they might mean something more complex than a denial of location. They might be attempting to articulate a state in which the concept of there-ness, of being physically and consciously present in a specific time and place, had become genuinely ambiguous in their experience. She also noted, with the precision of someone who had spent years listening carefully to what people said and did not say, that Vaughan had used the past tense. Not, "I am not there. I was not there." He was placing the statement in the past. He was describing something that had ended, or that had been, at the moment of speaking, in the process of ending. The question this raises is one that neither Hartmann nor anyone else has been able to answer, and it is the question that sits at the center of everything. If he was not there, where was he? And if wherever he was is expressible as a location, a geological shelf, a deep, cold underwater place, a region below the surface of the ordinary world, then how did a man survive it? And if he survived it, what did that survival cost him? Because the costs are visible. They are documented across 4 decades of fragmentary record: the refusal to speak, the inability to tolerate warmth, the nocturnal rituals that no one who observed them could agree on, but that all agreed were rituals, purposeful, repeated, performed with the gravity of obligation rather than the randomness of compulsion. The slight smile that had traveled a long distance, the persistent, methodical, utterly self-sufficient solitude, the late private 4-word utterance to a teenage boy who kept it for 15 years because he understood instinctively that it was sacred. These are the costs of something. They are the specific shape of an absence, the outline pressed into the world by whatever it was that had happened and whatever it was that could not be said. There is one final document. In 1950, in a small town in northern Ontario whose name does not appear in any previous documentation connected to Vaughan, a death certificate was filed for a man giving his age as approximately 70 and listing his occupation as retired laborer. The name on the certificate was Elias Vaughan. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, cardiac. The certifying physician noted that the deceased had lived alone in a 1-room dwelling on the outskirts of the town for approximately 8 years, had had no known family, and had been found by a neighbor who had not seen him for several days. The physician also noted in the remarks section that was not a required field and was rarely used, one observation. He wrote, "Deceased presented no signs of the physical deterioration typically associated with advanced age." The body appeared to be in the condition of a man significantly younger. This is noted for the record, and I have no medical explanation to offer for it. The neighbor who found him, an elderly woman who gave a brief statement to the local municipal office as part of the death registration process, added one detail to the administrative file that was not specifically requested, but that she felt was relevant. She said that when she entered his room, she found him lying in his bed in the position of a man who had lain down deliberately, with composure, who had not died in distress. She said he looked, in her words, like a man who had finally decided to come back. Come back from where, she did not say. She may not have known that she was asking a question. She was simply an old woman in a cold room, looking at a man she had barely known, trying to find the right words for something that did not quite have them. He had spent 41 years in the world after Kessler's landing. 41 years of documented silence, of refusals, of standing in the cold at 3 in the morning, of insomnia and endurance, and that particular quality of reserve that the French language has a better word for than English does. Recueillement, a gathering inward, a withdrawing into a private interior where outside voices do not reach. He refused every interview, not out of hostility, not out of fear. At least that is not the reading that the evidence supports. He refused every interview because, and this is the interpretation that the documentary record, read carefully and in totality, most consistently suggests, he had concluded that the interview, as a form, was inadequate, that the questions available to be asked were not the right questions, that the language available to answer them, even if he had wanted to answer, did not contain the necessary words. What can be said is this: a man disappeared into a northern winter and returned from somewhere that was not there. He returned healthy by every physical measure, aged beyond the calendar by every indirect one. He returned speaking 4 words in French to a teenager who was wise enough to keep them. He spent the rest of his life, by every observable indication, in a state not of trauma, but of knowledge, the specific, burdensome, inexpressible knowledge of a man who has been somewhere that no vocabulary has yet mapped. He wrote one letter to a dissolved company, asking about a geological shelf beneath a dark lake. He slept without blankets in rooms that fell below freezing, and woke without distress. He stood in the night and faced the cold as though the cold were a familiar. He lived to an age that did not match his appearance, and he died composedly, in a small room, in a northern town, having spoken to no one about what he knew. The neighbor said he looked like a man who had decided to come back, which leaves really only one question, not where he had been, because that may be unanswerable in any ordinary sense, not what he had seen, because that too has retreated beyond the reach of any document that currently exists. The question is this: from the moment he walked back out of the trees in February of 1909 until the morning that neighbor opened his door 51 years later, in which direction was Elias Vaughan always traveling? Toward us or away?